Hello again. I thought I would look today at how it's possible to create the impression of a crime wave without one actually occurring. And the British are very, very good at this particular type of optical illusion. It's almost the received wisdom today that the use of guns by ever younger offenders is on the rise. This is often linked to gang-related violence. Surely there must be some objective way of deciding whether this is true. Are children really becoming involved with firearms now in a way which would have been unheard of 60 years ago? The news media have for the last few years been full of reports about a supposed rise in gun crime in Britain, with particular reference to the number of children who have been arrested for carrying or using firearms. The BBC, for instance, reported in March 2015 that children as young as 10 were among hundreds of youngsters held over suspected firearms offences. Between 2013 and 2015, the newspapers linked all this to gangs. In April 2016, the Office for National Statistics reported that there had been a rise in firearms offences. Here surely is solid evidence that childhood has changed since the baby boomers were children. It would have been inconceivable 60 years ago for a 10-year-old to be handling firearms, or for a girl of 13 to have shot somebody. Both incidents which were covered by the alarming figures obtained from various police forces by means of Freedom of Information requests in 2016. If this doesn't show how modern childhood is going off the rails, then nothing will. There's a good deal more going on here than meets the eye, and the claim that children as young as 10 are being arrested for firearms offences is horribly misleading. The truth is that the offences which are being cited here were all far more common in the 1950s than they are now. Once again, we are being led up the garden path in the most interesting fashion. Could we simply look at the statistics for this to make up our minds? Perhaps trying to find out how many young people under the age of 18 were arrested or convicted for offences related to firearms in 1956 and then comparing them with last year's figures, say. There must be an objective measure of how many children were involved in gun crime then and now, one would have thought. We come now to another of those tricky points, the near impossibility of just placing one set of figures next to another and seeing which is the larger. To see why this would be, we must look at how firearms offences were treated in the baby boomer years. First, some modern figures. Roughly 7,000 firearms offences are recorded each year in Britain. This figure is without doubt higher than in the 1950s or 1960s. In the year ending March 2015, 7,866 firearms offences were recorded in England and Wales, and at first sight this sounds horrifying, as though we're living in the Wild West. A close look at the statistics, though, is a little more reassuring. Firearms offences covers a very broad spectrum, ranging from firing a machine gun during a terrorist attack to covering a stick with a plastic carrier bag and telling a cashier in a local off-licence you have a gun pointing at him. Both are recorded as firearms offences. For most of us, guns mean firearms which use explosive ammunition and are capable of killing somebody. That's certainly the definition used by the Crown Prosecution Service, and before that by the Director of Public Prosecutions. Only a small minority of the 7,866 firearms offences, though, recorded in England and Wales in the year ending 2015 involved proper guns of this sort. In the main, they were associated with replica weapons, air guns, and claims by somebody to be carrying a firearm, even if this was impossible to verify. Interestingly, despite the hysteria, public hysteria I should say, over gun crime, only 19 people were actually killed by guns that year, the lowest figures since records began in that form in 1969. Fancy that. Fewer people are being killed each year by guns in Britain than were during the 1960s. This is not something you would guess by looking at the news headlines. On average, over the last few years, fewer than 30 people a year die by being deliberately shot. Some of these are suicides, others are accidents. The case of the 13-year-old girl who shot somebody, according to the figures released in 2016, is particularly interesting as an example of the way that a fear can be worked up from almost nothing. In this case, it wasn't even an air gun that was used. The child had fired an American BB gun, which projects miniature ball bearings by means of a spring-powered action. A BB gun might sting a little if you're hit by the ball from one, but they're little more than toys. If figures for firearms offences have been collected and categorised in this way during the 1950s, with every child firing an air rifle or a BB gun in public being classified as a dangerous criminal, then it's a fair guess that the statistics would have gone off the scale. Even breaking a window with a pellet from an air gun is today recorded as a firearms offence. These days it's all but unheard of for a child to have in his or her possession an air rifle or air pistol. No shop would dream of selling such a thing to a child, and there can be few parents who would even think of giving an air gun to their children as a present, at least unless it was to be used under the strictest parental supervision. How very different the situation was 60 years ago. In those days, almost any group of boys included one carrying an air pistol. Today, firing an air gun in public, whether or not the pellet hit anyone, would be at once listed as a firearms offence. If this had been done in the 1960s, I shudder to think what the number of technical firearms offences would have been. I'm going to talk about this subject in the future, as I'm very keen to look at things actually as they are today and how they're portrayed in the media. In the meantime, older readers might wonder or ask themselves how many times they saw air guns being fooled around with in their childhood, and they might also remember the William books, where William's always carrying an air gun whenever he can get his hands on one. Since most firearms offences involve that sort of weapon, and no more people are being killed by firearms now than were in the 1960s, we might actually suspect that the headlines that we're seeing are more than a little misleading.